I didn't wear black to his wedding. I wore emerald, the same color he once said made my eyes glow in the sunlight. It was a quiet protest, not for him, but for myself. I held a small velvet collar in my hand. His dog's collar. Our dog's collar. Benny had been ours for almost 10 years before the divorce. And even after everything, the poor boy never stopped trying to run back to me. So I decided to return the last thing tying us together. I didn't sneak in. I didn't cause a scene. I walked in through the front doors of the church like I belonged there, because for 19 years, I had. This man didn't just walk away from a relationship. He walked away from my loyalty, my laughter, and every piece of myself I'd quietly stitched into his life. But today wasn't about revenge. It was about letting go. For both of us. The moment I stepped in, the entire room tensed. I saw familiar faces freeze, whispers ripple like a wave across pews. I didn't care. My eyes found him instantly. Colin. He stood under the soft yellow lights of the altar in a tailored navy suit, looking nervous. Not in love, just unsettled. Like he knew something wasn't sitting right in his gut but couldn't name it yet. I held Benny's collar tight and took 2 more steps forward. Then I heard her voice. Lana's voice, sharper than I remembered. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed, stepping slightly forward in her fitted lace gown. Her veil fluttered behind her like it was trying to escape. The room went completely silent. Colin turned. He looked at me. Not a glance, not a flicker. A look. Full. Real. Unavoidable. His eyes dropped to the collar in my hand. That was when everything changed. He stepped away from her, from the altar, from the life he had supposedly chosen. In that second, everything he'd buried rose to the surface. Guilt, shame, longing, or maybe just clarity. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked. And Lana? She called his name. Twice. Maybe 3 times. I didn't count. I just stood there. The collar still in my hand, and the past collapsing behind us like a house of cards. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Before everything fell apart, my life with Colin was calm, simple, and, I thought, enough. We met in our 30s, long after most of our friends had already married, divorced, or remarried. I had just opened a flower shop in downtown McMinnville, Oregon, a tiny place tucked between a bakery and a secondhand bookstore. Colin was a high school English teacher who came in one day needing a bouquet for his mother's birthday. He didn't know the difference between a daisy and a daffodil, but he picked them with such thoughtfulness that I asked him out first. That became our joke for years. She made the first move and I never looked back. For almost 2 decades, we were each other's people. No kids by choice, but we had Benny, a golden lab with eyes like warm tea. We took long Sunday walks, always hand in hand, with Benny trotting beside us. Every evening after closing the shop, I'd find Colin grading papers on the porch while Benny slept under his chair. I would bring him a cup of chamomile tea and sit beside him as the sun dipped behind the trees. We weren't flashy or dramatic. There were no grand vacations, no diamond-studded anniversaries, just quiet routines. Morning coffee, crossword puzzles, grocery shopping at the same corner store where the clerk knew us by name. He'd kiss my forehead every time I handed him his lunch before school. He said it made him feel lucky, and I believed him. I wasn't the woman who needed constant affirmations or Instagram-worthy gestures. I just wanted consistency, loyalty, a life built on small kindnesses and trust. And that's exactly what I thought we had. My younger sister, May, would tease us. "You two are the last of the analog romantics," she'd say, watching us bicker gently over what to watch on TV. She was the spontaneous one. 3 marriages in, 2 grown kids, and a passport covered in stamps. But she'd always tell me, "You got the rare one, Alora. The steady one. Don't take it for granted." I didn't. I cooked his favorite meals, even when I was too tired to eat myself. I packed extra snacks in his lunch on Fridays, and I remembered to send his mother a birthday card every single year. I even started listening to his favorite audiobooks so we could talk about them on long drives. And when I lost my father to a stroke 5 years ago, Colin held me through every night I couldn't sleep. He canceled classes, ran the flower shop for me, and even sat through the funeral with silent strength. That was the man I knew. That was the man I gave all of myself to, and he gave me Benny. We adopted him during our 10th year together, after a weekend trip to the coast. Benny was clumsy, affectionate, always drooling, always by my side. Colin used to call him our fuzzball, and we joked that if we ever separated, we'd fight over Benny like people fought over kids. That joke didn't age well. But back then, things felt unshakable. Even holidays were cozy. We didn't travel far, just small dinners with May and her kids. Colin always helped me hang the wreaths on our porch and pretended to hate it when I played carols in October, but he'd hum them when he thought I wasn't listening. I look back now and wonder if the cracks were already forming and I simply chose not to see them. If his quiet days were already filled with someone else's laughter. If his kind gestures had started running on autopilot while his heart drifted elsewhere. But you don't question the floor beneath your feet until it breaks. And mine didn't break all at once. It gave way slowly like a rotting beam, creaking here, bending there, until the collapse came so gently I almost didn't notice I'd fallen. That's the danger of quiet love. It doesn't leave behind fireworks or slammed doors. It disappears like a scent in the wind, subtle, unannounced. And before you know it, you're standing in an empty kitchen, 2 mugs on the table, and no one left to drink with. The first crack in our perfect picture came on an ordinary Tuesday. It was early spring, the kind where mornings still carried frost, but afternoons hinted at warmth. I had just trimmed fresh tulips from the greenhouse and arranged them into a bouquet for the bakery's anniversary next door. Benny lay at my feet like he always did, chin on his paws, tracking my every move. Colin walked in late from school, muttering about a department meeting that should have been an email. He dropped his bag by the door, rubbed Benny's head absent-mindedly, and barely looked at me before heading to the fridge. No hi, no kiss, no, "How was your day?" Just silence, followed by the clinking of a beer bottle against the counter. I brushed it off. He's tired, I told myself. Teachers had rough days, and he'd been carrying more weight than usual since a few staff members left. Still, something inside me tilted. A small, invisible lean. The kind of feeling you ignore because it feels easier to pretend everything is fine than to start asking why it isn't. Later that evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, I heard Colin laughing in the study. Not just a chuckle, a full, deep, genuine laugh. The kind I hadn't heard from him in weeks. I smiled, relieved. Maybe he was watching one of those goofy videos he liked. But as I passed by the study with a stack of towels, I heard a woman's voice through the door, faint but unmistakable. He was on a call. I paused. Then I did something I still regret. I stood there, listening. Not quite eavesdropping, not quite walking away. Her voice was light, teasing, young. Colin said something I couldn't make out. Something low and tender. Then silence. When I opened the door, casually, acting like I had laundry to put away, he turned fast. His hand flew to the laptop and he clicked something closed. "Oh, hey," he said too quickly. "Just grading papers. What's up?" "Just dropping off your clean socks," I replied, setting them down without looking at him too long. I smiled, he smiled. We both pretended. That was the moment. The first red flag. It wasn't dramatic. No lipstick on a collar, no texts left open. Just a shift in the air, like someone had moved a picture frame an inch to the left. Everything still looked the same, but it didn't feel aligned. Over the next few days, I watched for more shifts. He stopped joining Benny and me for our walks, saying his knee was bothering him. Benny would whine at the door, confused. Colin used to insist those walks were our family hour. Now he barely noticed when we left. I mentioned it once, lightly. Benny misses our evening strolls. Colin didn't even glance up from his phone. "You two go ahead. I'll walk him tomorrow." But tomorrow came and went, and the day after that. Then one Sunday, May stopped by for brunch. She brought pastries and her usual flurry of questions. We sat outside, sun on our backs, sipping coffee. Colin came out briefly to say hello, gave her a hug, and went right back inside. No chit-chat, no teasing jokes like he used to. After he left, May leaned in and whispered, "Is he okay?" "He's just tired. End of term," I replied. She didn't push, but she gave me a long, knowing look, the kind only sisters can give, the kind that says, "I see what you're pretending not to." That night, I couldn't sleep. Colin had turned in early, saying he had a headache. Benny curled up beside me on the couch. I stroked his fur and stared at the ceiling, asking myself a question I hadn't dared to ask in nearly 20 years. Is he falling out of love with me? I didn't answer it. I just sat there, holding the silence like it was something breakable, hoping somehow it wasn't real. It's strange how distance doesn't always look like someone walking away. Sometimes it's a coffee cup placed silently on the counter instead of handed to you, or a pause before a reply that never used to be there, or the way their body turns ever so slightly away from you in bed. Just enough to notice, but not enough to call out. That's how it started with Colin. He didn't yell, he didn't storm off, he just faded. The man who used to hum Bob Dylan while unloading groceries now came home with headphones in. He stopped waiting for me to close the shop before dinner. I'd walk into the kitchen to find an empty plate in the sink and a Post-it on the fridge. Ate earlier, leftover pasta in the pot. No love you, no see you later, just tasks, notes, silence. Benny felt it too. He began spending more time with me at the shop. On days I didn't bring him, he'd sit by the door for hours, waiting, listening, hoping. One evening, I came home late from helping May with her roof leak. I was covered in dust, aching all over, and craving nothing but a hot bath and a soft bed. Colin was in the living room, eyes locked on the TV. I smiled weakly and dropped my keys in the bowl by the door. "Long day," I said, hoping for some warmth. Some sign that he still noticed my presence in the world. He didn't even turn his head. "Hey," he said flatly. That was it. No follow-up, no. Everything okay with May? No curiosity, no care. I stood there for a moment too long. Then I walked straight to the bathroom and shut the door quietly behind me. In the mirror, I studied my own face. My skin looked tired, my eyes dull. But what caught me most was my mouth. Tight, cautious, as if always on the edge of saying something, but never quite daring to. I tried to shake it off. Marriage had its dry spells. Maybe he was stressed. Maybe I was too sensitive. But even in my effort to rationalize it, I could feel the truth prickling beneath the surface. We had stopped touching. Not just physically, though that too. There were no more absent-minded brushes of hands, no fingers trailing my arm as he passed behind me, no goodnight kisses. He didn't even graze my back in bed anymore. Our king-size mattress had become a wall of silence. One night, I reached over just to touch his shoulder, not out of desire, but desperation. I just wanted to feel human, connected, seen. He shifted in his sleep, pulling the blanket tighter. Not cruelly, just instinctively, as if his body no longer remembered mine. A few days later, I found a book on the nightstand I hadn't seen before. The Mindful Teacher, Balancing Life in and Out of the Classroom. There was a small bookmark with a handwritten note tucked inside. Keep showing up, even when the world stops clapping. L. I stared at that letter until it blurred. Lana, the woman from school, the same voice I'd overheard on the laptop weeks ago. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I just placed the book back exactly as I found it, closed the bedroom door, and lay beside Benny in the den. That became my routine. I stopped waiting up. I stopped asking questions. I filled the silences with the sound of classical music and the whir of my flower cooler. I told myself that if I just kept moving, kept working, kept functioning, the emptiness wouldn't catch up to me. But it did. At the flower shop, I began forgetting orders, something I'd never done in 20 years. A bride-to-be came in one afternoon, giddy and glowing, describing the lilies she wanted in her bouquet. I smiled and nodded, but as she left, My chest ached in a way I couldn't explain. I wasn't jealous. I was grieving. Grieving a love that was still technically mine, but no longer alive. A love that had withered in slow, invisible ways, like petals crushed under glass, untouched but suffocating. I began to understand. I was no longer part of Colin's emotional world. I was just the furniture, familiar, present, easy to ignore. And the worst part? I was starting to accept it. There's a specific kind of pain that comes not from what someone says, but from what they allow others to see. What they let happen while you're standing right there, visible, present, and utterly dismissed. That pain found me one evening in early September at a fundraiser for Colin's school. He hadn't invited me. The invitation came through May, whose best friend's son was also a teacher there. She casually mentioned it over coffee one morning, saying, "Are you going to the fall gala? I heard Colin's on the planning committee." I hadn't known. When I asked him that night if he needed help setting up, I used to arrange flowers for the event every year. He shrugged and said, "It's mostly staff now. They're trying to keep it simple." Still, something told me to go. Not to prove a point, not even to see him, just to remind myself that I still belonged somewhere. I wore a navy dress, not fancy but elegant, paired with the gold locket Colin had given me for our 15th anniversary. Benny watched me get ready, tail wagging, sensing something different in my movements. When I opened the door to leave, he let out a soft whine, like he was afraid I wouldn't come back the same. The event was held at the town's cultural center. Dressed up in twinkling lights and round tables draped in linen, the air smelled like champagne and catered appetizers. I saw familiar faces, teachers, spouses, neighbors, many of whom offered polite smiles, some uncertain, some overly enthusiastic, like they didn't know whether I was still Mrs. Riley or something else entirely. And then I saw him. Colin stood near the far wall next to the dessert table, his hand resting lightly on the back of a woman's chair. Lana, of course. Her dress was sleek, her makeup perfect. She looked young, not in years, but in posture, like someone who hadn't yet felt life's weight settle into her bones. I didn't walk toward them. I didn't need to. They came to me, or rather, Lana did. She greeted me with that overly bright smile people use when they're pretending not to see the wreckage they caused. "Elora, right. I've heard so much about you," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. I shook it. Briefly, coolly. Colin arrived a second later, half a step behind her. He didn't touch me, didn't even say my name, just nodded like I was another colleague, someone he'd seen in passing. His eyes darted to my locket, then away. He said, "Glad you could make it. Glad I could make it." I stood there, wondering if anyone else could feel the quiet weight pressing against my ribs. Lana linked her arm through his and leaned in with a soft laugh. "We were just talking about the fall play. Colin's helping with costumes this year. Isn't that adorable?" Colin chuckled, the sound flat but cooperative. Then she added, almost too casually, "I told him he should let me dress him more often. You know, give him some flair." I opened my mouth, not sure what I was about to say, but before I could form words, Colin turned to someone else, a teacher I vaguely knew, and started a new conversation. Just like that, like I wasn't even there. Lana stayed a beat longer, smiling through the tension. "Well, enjoy the night," she said, before turning to follow him. I was left holding my clutch with both hands, fingers trembling slightly, watching as the man who used to kiss my forehead in grocery store aisles disappeared into a crowd with someone who hadn't yet memorized the way he took his coffee. People glanced at me, then quickly looked away. I stood by the entrance for a few more minutes, pretending to scroll through my phone. Then I left. When I got home, Benny met me at the door. I sat on the floor in that navy dress, buried my face in his fur, and cried. Not because he had moved on, but because in that room full of people, I had never felt so invisible. And I realized then that heartbreak wasn't always loud. Sometimes it sounded like laughter from across the room, laughter you used to be part of. I didn't leave with a bang. I left with a whisper. There wasn't a final fight, no shouting match, no broken plates or slammed doors, just a slow exhale, the kind your body releases when your soul finally admits the truth your heart has been denying for far too long. The fundraiser had bruised me in a way I couldn't name. The next morning, I woke up and looked at Colin across the bed. He was already dressed, tying his shoes, humming to himself. There was no hangover of regret in his posture, no indication that he remembered how he'd treated me the night before. Or worse, that he did remember and simply didn't care. He left without saying goodbye. I made coffee in silence. Benny sat at my feet looking up at me like he knew. Dogs always know. I watched the steam rise from my mug and realized I couldn't remember the last time someone had made me a cup of coffee. Not out of obligation, just love. Later that day, I opened the hallway closet and stared at our photo albums stacked on the top shelf. I didn't take them down. I didn't want to relive the early years, the laughter, the vacations, the anniversary picnics by the lake. Those memories weren't comforting anymore. They were sharpened blades I didn't want to run my fingers over. That afternoon, Colin came home later than usual. I was sitting on the back porch with Benny, a blanket over my legs and an untouched cup of tea beside me. He didn't ask how my day was. He just said, "I think we need some time apart." I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I just said, "Okay." I think he was expecting resistance. Maybe a question, a breakdown, a plea. But I gave him none of it. I wasn't agreeing out of grace. I was surrendering because I had already left him in my heart weeks ago. He moved out the next morning, taking only what he needed. His clothes, his laptop, a few books, not Benny. He left him without a word, like Benny had been mine all along. I watched him pack from the hallway, arms folded, jaw clenched. The part that hurt the most wasn't the leaving. It was how light he seemed as he walked out the door, as if he was shedding weight, not saying goodbye to a life. May came over that night, holding a bottle of wine and a grocery bag full of frozen dinners. She didn't ask questions, just heated up lasagna and sat beside me on the couch while we ate in silence. When we finished, she said, "You were holding up a house he'd already abandoned, Elora. You did everything you could." I nodded, but the grief didn't hit me like a wave. It came in small, quiet moments, like when I reached for 2 plates at dinner out of habit, or when I heard a song on the radio we used to dance to in the kitchen and had to pull over because my hands started shaking, or when Benny sat by the door for hours, waiting for a man who would never come back. The town talked, as small towns do. Whispers in the grocery store aisles, sympathetic glances at the farmer's market. Some people offered cliches. "You'll bounce back. You deserve better. It's his loss." Others said nothing at all, which sometimes hurt even more. I tried to return to work, but my hands were clumsy with the flowers. The arrangements looked fine, but they had no life, no story, no soul, just color and symmetry. Eventually, I closed the shop for a week and stayed in May's guest house. It was tiny, just one room with a kitchenette and a bed barely big enough for me and Benny. But it felt safe, untouched, quiet. Each night, I lit a single candle and sat in silence. I wasn't meditating. I wasn't praying. I was simply learning how to be alone without feeling abandoned. One evening, I looked down at Benny asleep on the floor beside me. His tail thumped once in his sleep, and I realized something simple and painful. No one had pushed me out, but I had stayed long after I was supposed to leave, and now, finally, I was gone. Rock bottom wasn't a moment. It wasn't the day Colin moved out. It wasn't the first night I slept alone. It wasn't even the realization that the man I'd loved for nearly 2 decades had fallen for someone else under my nose. It came later, quietly, unannounced. It came in the form of a grocery list. I was standing in the middle of the cereal aisle, holding a crumpled piece of paper I'd used for years. The same scrap where I used to write Colin's granola and his yogurt. I stood there, staring at the list, realizing I didn't need to buy half of it anymore. I didn't know what kind of cereal I liked. I had always picked his. I left my cart right there and walked out without buying a thing. I drove back to the guest house and sat in my car with the engine off. The sun had already dipped behind the horizon, leaving a pale orange glow over the pine trees. Benny rested his head on my thigh, sensing the shift in me but unsure how to help. The tears came without sound. I wasn't sobbing, I wasn't screaming, I was simply unraveling. The kind of unraveling that makes you feel like air, weightless, invisible, without substance. I had become a ghost in my own life. Inside, I curled up on the floor, not even making it to the bed. Benny curled beside me, and we stayed like that all night. No lights, no dinner, just breathing, just enduring. The next morning, I found myself staring at the reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked like someone I didn't recognize. My once wavy chestnut hair hung limp and streaked with silver, my skin dull, lips dry, and eyes swollen from too many nights of crying in silence. My body hadn't changed much, but my posture had. I didn't stand tall anymore. I bent slightly, like I was bracing for something, even in stillness. That day, I stayed in my pajamas and didn't open the curtains. May knocked on the door around noon with homemade soup. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Not because I didn't love her, but because I couldn't face kindness. Kindness would break me more than cruelty ever could. I began losing time. Days bled into each other like watercolor on damp paper. I'd go to bed at 6 p.m. and wake up at 2 a.m., then sit on the floor staring at the shadows Benny cast on the wall. I fed him, walked him, bathed him, but I did it like a machine. He was the only reason I kept moving at all. One night, I found Colin's old flannel shirt in a box I hadn't unpacked. I pressed it to my face and inhaled. Nothing. No scent, just cloth and memories. That was the breaking point, not the silence, not the betrayal, but the realization that the very thing I used to associate with comfort, with home, now meant nothing. It was just fabric. I tore it in half, then into quarters, then into strips so thin they looked like ribbons. Afterward, I sat on the floor surrounded by the remains, my hands shaking, heart pounding, unsure if I'd just destroyed a relic or freed myself from a curse. That night, I dreamt of my father. He was standing on the porch of our childhood home, smiling with his arms crossed, watching me trim roses from his garden. In the dream, he said only one thing. "Elora, this isn't the end. It's the quiet before you grow." I woke up sobbing, real sobs, the kind that rack your chest and pull grief up from the gut, and when it ended, when the tears were spent, I felt empty, but also still. Like I had finally scraped the bottom of the well and was ready to look up. Rock bottom, I realized, wasn't the fall. It was the silence after the crash, the breath you finally take once you know there's no lower to go. And for the first time in months, I stood up without trembling. Benny looked at me from the couch, his tail thumping once. I whispered, "We're not done yet." It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that makes the air smell like wet pavement and old pine needles. I hadn't planned on going to the shop, but something pulled me there. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the weight of sitting still for too many days in a row. Or maybe I needed to remember who I used to be. The version of me who created beauty out of nothing but stems and wire and ribbon. The flower shop had been closed for weeks. I unlocked the door slowly, almost like I was breaking into someone else's life. Inside, it smelled like dust and dried eucalyptus. The cooler hummed faintly in the back, the sound oddly comforting. I flipped the lights on and wandered to the back room, where we kept unused inventory, tools, and old memory boxes I hadn't touched in years. Benny followed me in, his nails clicking softly against the tile floor. I opened a cabinet, searching for floral tape, when a small cardboard box fell off the top shelf and landed at my feet. I bent down, expecting receipts or unused decor. But what I found stopped me cold. Inside the box was a velvet pouch, one I immediately recognized. It was the pouch I used to store gifts before wrapping them. Tucked inside was a silver charm bracelet. Not just any bracelet. It was one Colin had once planned to give me. Each charm told a piece of our story. A tiny daisy for our first flower shop delivery, a book for his love of literature, a heart with Benny's name etched in it. I held it in my hand, stunned by the weight. Not of the metal, but of the memories. There were 4 charms in total, but as I turned the bracelet over, I saw a 5th charm, one I'd never seen before. It was a small rose gold music note, On the back, engraved in tiny script, were the initials LS and a date. The date was 3 months before Colin left, 3 months before he told me he needed space. My breath caught. I stared at the charm for what felt like hours. It didn't make sense at first. Why would a bracelet he intended for me have her initials? Why would he leave it hidden, forgotten in the back of our shop? And then it clicked. He hadn't left it for me. He'd bought it for her. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe he meant to keep it hidden until he gave it to her. Maybe he never got the chance. But what I knew, deep in my bones, was that while I was still putting his lunch together and kissing him goodbye, while I was still folding his laundry and buying his cereal and watching the door for him to come home, he was planning gifts for someone else. I didn't cry. Not immediately. I felt something colder. Detachment. A strange stillness, like I had stepped outside my own life and was watching someone else's tragedy play out. I placed the bracelet gently on the counter and sat down hard on the stool beside it. Benny came to rest his head on my knee, his eyes searching mine. "You knew before I did," I whispered, stroking his fur. And then the tears came, not for what he'd done, but for how long I'd convinced myself I was crazy for suspecting it. I had gaslit myself for months, defended him, blamed exhaustion, midlife stress, my own flaws. I told myself I was being paranoid, needy, oversensitive, but this charm proved what my gut had known all along. I wasn't paranoid. I was betrayed. I stayed in the shop for hours that day. I cleaned, reorganized, even arranged a few small vases of leftover baby's breath and carnations. I wasn't ready to reopen. Not yet, but I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Agency, not anger, not revenge. Just a growing clarity. The bracelet didn't hurt because it represented another woman. It hurt because it showed me that Colin had already emotionally replaced me before he physically left. And now, finally, I had proof. Not to confront him, not to shame him, but to free myself. That night, I wrapped the bracelet in tissue, placed it inside Benny's old collar, and tied it shut with ribbon. Not as a gift. As a farewell. Something changed in me after I found that bracelet. Not loudly, not overnight, but something fundamental shifted. Like the first deep crack in winter ice, warning that the surface can no longer hold the weight. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel spite. I felt done. Not defeated. Done. Done waiting for apologies that would never come. Done spinning old memories into excuses. Done grieving a version of love that had died long before I'd buried it. For the first time in months, I stopped looking at the door, hoping Colin would walk through it and say he made a mistake. I stopped reaching for my phone and rereading our old texts. I even stopped wondering if Lana had something I didn't. Younger skin, more energy, fewer gray hairs. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about me. I woke up the next morning and didn't lie in bed. I made it. Smooth and firm, corners tucked, a simple act, but it felt like reclaiming something. I brewed coffee for myself instead of automatically pouring 2 cups. I didn't glance at the second mug. I didn't reach for it out of habit. I dressed in real clothes, not soft, sagging sweatpants or the same hoodie I'd worn for a week straight. A fitted blouse, my favorite jeans, and the leather flats I always saved for better days. I looked at myself in the mirror and pulled my hair back. There were new lines around my mouth, softer cheeks, a dullness in my eyes. But there was also resolve. I walked Benny down to the lake that morning, the one Colin and I used to visit every summer, where we'd feed ducks and share a thermos of lemonade like kids. For the first time, I didn't feel haunted by ghosts on that path. I felt quiet. Not numb, not anymore. Still, present. And somewhere in that stillness, something stirred inside me. That afternoon, I reopened my laptop for the first time in weeks. My email inbox had dozens of messages, most of them from loyal customers wondering when the shop would open again. A few were wedding requests. One was a simple subject line from an old regular named Missy, who always ordered a bouquet for her mother's birthday. "We miss you." I read that line over and over until I started to cry. Not because I was sad, because I was needed, because I still had something to give. The world hadn't stopped turning just because my heart had. Life was still out there, blooming, waiting for me to come back to it. The next morning, I swept the floors of the flower shop. I refilled the buckets. I rearranged the front display. I cleaned the register, wiped the dust from the windows, and rehung the chalkboard sign outside. Open soon, blooming through the storm. People started peeking in as they walked past. A few knocked. I smiled through the glass, waved, and held up a sign I scribbled with a Sharpie. Back Monday. Thank you for waiting. And they had waited. So had I. But now, I was done waiting. That weekend, I drove out to the coast alone. No destination, just me, Benny, and a packed lunch in the back seat. I parked near a quiet trail, one Colin and I had once hiked together, and walked it again by myself. The same trees, the same smell of wet pine, the same rhythm of crunching gravel underfoot. But I wasn't the same. At the lookout point, I sat on the bench overlooking the water and pulled the bracelet from my bag. I unwrapped it slowly, stared at the tiny charms, the symbols of a life I had given my all to and been abandoned in. Then I tossed it gently into the sea. Not out of hate, not out of revenge, out of release. As the bracelet disappeared into the gray-blue water, I whispered, I loved with my whole heart. That's nothing to be ashamed of. Benny leaned against my leg, and for the first time in a long time, I let the wind wrap around me like a welcome instead of a warning. That day, I didn't just walk a trail. I started walking back to myself. Healing didn't look like grand declarations. It looked like lists, sticky notes on the fridge, Google Calendar reminders, a small spiral notebook I kept in my purse labeled Next. Not to do, not fix, just next. Because I wasn't trying to undo what had happened. I was simply learning how to move forward, quietly, deliberately. No one knew what I was doing. Not even May. She assumed I was still resting, still tending to the cracks in my chest. And in many ways, I was. But underneath the surface, something else had begun. I called my accountant first, a gentle woman named Sandra who'd helped us file joint taxes for over a decade. I scheduled a private meeting and asked, what does my financial life look like now as just me? She walked me through it with warmth and without pity. I listened, took notes, made decisions. Then I called the landlord of the space next to my flower shop, a tiny unit that had been empty for months. I have an idea, I said. It's small, but it could work. He offered me a reduced rate to lease it short term. I said yes. I didn't tell anyone what it would be. Not yet. Not until I was ready. Back at the flower shop, I painted the front door a deep plum. I repotted the plants in the windowsill and brought in fresh eucalyptus for the scent. I restocked the vases. I rearranged the walk-in cooler, organizing everything the way I liked it, not the way Colin had suggested years ago. I even started a small blog on my old business website. Quiet reflections, weekly musings. I didn't use my full name, just Elora B. I didn't promote it, didn't expect readers, but people came, slowly. One post at a time, they commented things like, "This feels like my life," or "Thank you for putting it into words," and I began to realize the pain hadn't made me smaller. It had made me sharper, more awake, more real. In the evenings, I took Benny on longer walks, not to escape, but to breathe. I listened to audiobooks, the same ones I used to read with Colin. Only now I listened for me. Not to bond, not to impress, just to enjoy. I made a playlist called Morning Light and played it while watering the succulents in the shop. I added more color to my arrangements. Bold peonies, wild sunflowers, deep burgundy dahlias. Customers noticed. One woman came in and said, "There's something different in here, brighter." I smiled and handed her a bouquet. I'm still figuring it out. May stopped by one afternoon with a pastry box in hand. She leaned against the counter and said, "You're glowing a little, you know that?" I shrugged. Must be the peonies. But the truth was, I had found something again. Not joy, not yet, but rhythm. And rhythm, I'd learned, was the first heartbeat of healing. Behind the scenes, I kept building. I took a short online course in garden therapy. I read about grief rituals in different cultures. I brainstormed ideas for that extra shop space I'd quietly rented. At night, I scribbled thoughts in a leather journal. What do women like me need that no one offers? What would I have needed 6 months ago? How do I help others without losing myself again? These weren't business plans. They were blueprints for rebirth. I didn't need applause. I didn't need Colin to see what I was doing. I didn't want him to. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about becoming someone I respected again. Someone who didn't shrink to fit beside another person's ambition. The setup wasn't loud. It was late nights with tea and candles. It was returning library books and checking out new ones on self-trust and boundaries. It was quietly removing Colin's last name from my business license and choosing to go back to Elora Banks. Not to erase the years I'd lived as his wife, but to remind myself that I had a name before I had a role. By the end of that month, the flower shop wasn't just alive again. It was mine, entirely, authentically, undeniably, and while no one could see the roots growing beneath the surface, I knew what was coming. Something strong, something steady, something mine. At first, I didn't notice it. The shift was so gradual, so quiet, that it felt more like a change in the wind than a turning tide. But it was there, in the way people looked at me, in how they spoke to me, in the things they stopped saying. One day in early spring, I was setting up a floral arch outside the shop for a wedding shoot when a familiar car rolled to a slow stop at the curb. A silver sedan, Colin's. My hands froze around a bundle of baby's breath. The passenger window rolled down, and there she was, Lana. Hair slicked back in a tight bun, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just stared. I stared back, not with challenge, but with composure. Then she looked at the arch I'd been building. Her expression flickered. Then the window rolled back up and the car drove off. No words exchanged, but the air between us said enough. She hadn't expected to see me whole. She hadn't expected to see me thriving. I stood there for a moment, listening to the soft rustle of petals, the faint hum of traffic, and the sound of my own breath, steady, measured, calm. That was the first shift. The next came at the grocery store. I was picking out strawberries when Colin's mother, Evelyn, walked up to me. I hadn't seen her since the divorce, not since she sent a short, vague note saying, "I wish things had turned out differently." I assumed she had quietly taken Colin's side like so many others had, but there she was, standing beside me, holding a bag of sugar and a tentative smile. "Elora," she said gently, "I heard you reopened the shop." I nodded. "Yes, a few months ago." She looked down at her cart, then back at me. "I'm hosting my garden club next week. I was wondering if you still do custom arrangements." There it was. Not just a request. A re-entry. I told her I'd be happy to. She handed me her number, and as she turned to leave, she paused. "I never liked how he handled things," she said quietly. "You didn't deserve that." Then she walked away. A small apology, an even smaller justice. But it landed. People started coming back. Not to gossip, not to pry. They came for the warmth I had always given them, for the quiet beauty I created, for the comfort that somehow still lived in my hands. At the farmer's market, I overheard two women talking about Elora's shop as a place to get more than flowers. They said it was a place where people felt something again. They didn't know I was within earshot. I didn't correct them. That was the thing about the shift. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with fanfare. It moved through whispers, through glances, through the return of what had once been quietly taken. Colin, too, began appearing more frequently, not in person, but through ripples. I heard from a mutual friend that he and Lana were taking space. Apparently, things weren't going as smoothly as planned. Apparently, Lana had begun voicing concerns about how emotionally unavailable he was. I could have laughed, but I didn't, because I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting for karma to do my bidding. I wasn't waiting for him to hurt the way I had. The real shift, the true power, was that I no longer needed anything from him at all. One evening, I hosted a community floral class in the new studio space. We filled mason jars with wild flowers, laughed over mismatched colors, and shared stories about spring. A woman in her 40s came up to me afterward and said, "I just went through a divorce. I didn't think I could enjoy anything again, but this helped." I hugged her tightly because I knew. I knew the ache, the humiliation, the rebuilding, the silence of being left behind, and the thunder of choosing to stand anyway. I knew the climb, and I knew what it felt like when the climb turned into something else. Something solid. Something higher. Something free. The power didn't come from getting even. It came from no longer needing to. It came from walking through town with your head up, your name intact, and your heart still open. Not in spite of what happened, but because you lived through it, and rose anyway. The confrontation didn't come the way I once imagined it might, through an angry outburst, a teary showdown, or some dramatic reveal in front of a crowd. It came with a collar in my hand and peace in my heart. The wedding was small, tasteful, held in a country chapel Colin and I had once visited on a drive through wine country. When I found out the date, through a florist friend who had no idea about our history, I felt nothing but stillness, not curiosity, not anger, just a quiet certainty. It was time to return something that never belonged to me in the first place. Closure. Benny had passed just a month before. Old age had finally taken its toll, and I held him as he went, whispering thank you for every ounce of love he gave when I had none left to give. Afterward, I cleaned out his things. Most I donated to the local shelter, but I kept his first collar, leather worn, with a tarnished brass tag that simply read, "Benny. If found, please return home." It was the only thing I still had that tied me to Colin, and I didn't want to keep it anymore. So I went. Not to stop the wedding, not to see who Lana had become, but to put something down permanently. I didn't dress to make a statement. Just a dark green blouse, black slacks, simple earrings. I curled my hair the way I used to for date nights, but didn't look in the mirror too long. I didn't need to. I wasn't there to be seen. The chapel parking lot was full. I sat in my car for a minute before getting out. In my hand, a small box wrapped in cream paper and tied with sage ribbon. Benny's collar rested inside. I walked through the side garden toward the entrance. The smell of lilies and fresh-cut grass reminded me of the weddings I used to prepare for. The joy, the nervous energy, the beginnings. Today felt nothing like that. As I approached the doors, Lana stepped outside, her veil trailing behind her like a shadow. She wasn't alone. 2 bridesmaids flanked her, but they peeled off quickly when they saw me. Lana's face went pale. "Elora," she said. Not coldly, not kindly, just uncertain. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was low, urgent, the kind of voice people use when they're afraid of being embarrassed. I didn't flinch. "I'm not here to make a scene," I said calmly. "I just came to return something that belongs to Colin." She glanced down at the box in my hand. "I found it in my things after Benny passed. I thought it should go back to him, that's all." Before she could answer, the doors opened behind her and Colin stepped out. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't angry. He looked exactly how I remembered him at his most truthful. Startled, unguarded, and uncertain what to do next. His eyes went to the box, then to me, then to Lana. I held the box out between us, steady. I didn't come to interrupt anything. I just wanted to close the loop. He reached for it slowly, his fingers brushing mine. There was a beat of silence. Heavy, but not hostile. "Thank you," he said softly. I nodded once. "Take care of him," I added, though I wasn't sure whether I meant Benny's memory or himself. Then I turned to go. But before I took my second step, Colin's voice stopped me. "Elora." I turned. He didn't move. He didn't speak again. He just stood there, looking at me. Really looking at me. For the first time in years. And in that gaze, I saw it. The recognition of what he'd thrown away. The loss not of a relationship, but of a woman who had once been his home. His compass. His peace. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I turned again, walked down the path, and didn't look back. The air was lighter. I didn't feel victorious. This wasn't a win. It was a return. Not of an object, but of my own story. That box was never just a collar. It was the last thread tying me to a chapter I had already outgrown. And the moment I handed it over, I stepped out of that story and into my own. I thought the moment at the chapel would be the end of it, the last thread, the final exchange, the quiet closure. But life has a way of reserving one last turn in the road. Not a spectacle, not vengeance, just something so precise, so unexpected it feels like justice written by the universe itself. It came a week later. I was sweeping petals off the front porch of the flower shop when I noticed a familiar figure approaching. May was already inside arranging tulips, but I stayed out front, watching as the person drew closer. It was Robert, Colin's longtime friend, the one who used to double date with us back in the early days. We hadn't spoken since the divorce. He always struck me as decent, someone who tried to stay neutral even when loyalty was expected. He walked up with a hesitant smile, holding a manila envelope tucked under his arm. "Elora," he said with a nod. "Got a minute?" I motioned toward the bench beside the display window. He sat. "What brings you here?" I asked. He looked down for a moment, choosing his words. "I saw you at the wedding." My expression didn't change. So did they. He gave a small chuckle, then turned serious. "It didn't happen." I blinked. "What didn't?" "The wedding," he said. "Colin never walked back inside. After you left, he stood there frozen. Lana tried to pull him in for the vows. He said he needed air and never returned. Left everyone sitting for an hour before the priest called it. I was still, not shocked, just still." "Where is he now?" I asked. "Staying with a friend in Portland," Robert said. "From what I hear, Lana packed up and moved out of their place 2 days later. She was furious. Said she should have seen it coming." I didn't say anything. He reached into the envelope and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "He asked me to give this to you. Said he didn't want to send it through email. Thought you might actually read it on paper." I didn't take it right away. When I finally reached for it, I tucked it under my palm and nodded. "Thanks." "He wanted me to tell you." Robert paused, sighing. "He said he made the wrong choice. That it took seeing you again, really seeing you, to realize what he gave up." I looked out at the street. A breeze swept through, lifting the edge of a receipt pinned under a flower pot. A customer across the road waved. I waved back. When I turned to Robert again, I asked, "Do you think he means it?" "I think," he said slowly, "that he regrets who he became. I think he thought he'd get a simpler love with Lana, but when that didn't come with peace, he realized what he left behind." I nodded once more, the kind of slow nod that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. When he left, I placed the letter in my desk drawer without opening it. That drawer held spare scissors, unused sympathy cards, and backup ink for the receipt printer. It didn't need Colin's apology to function. Neither did I. But the twist wasn't just in the letter. It came 2 days later, in a much more unexpected way. I had submitted a piece to the Oregon Women in Business newsletter, an article called "Rebuilding from the Inside Out." It was something I wrote late one night, pouring everything I had learned into words I wasn't sure anyone would read. They did. The editor emailed me to say they loved it. They wanted to feature it, and me, in the upcoming issue. They asked for a photo, a short bio, and the name of my business. Elora Banks, owner of Wild Grace Floral Studio. That's what it would say. No husband's name. No trailing history. Just mine. When the issue was published, the response was overwhelming. New customers showed up. Old ones returned. Messages poured in. From women, from widows, from fellow divorcees. Some were strangers. Some were from this very town. Each one read like a quiet revolution. And that was the justice. Not Colin walking away from the altar. Not Lana leaving with nothing. Not the apology tucked into a drawer I never opened. The real justice was that I didn't need any of it, because I had become something they could no longer reach. Something they had underestimated. Whole, rooted, blooming, and absolutely untouchable. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I saw his name light up on my phone. Colin, not a call, just a text. I saw the article. "You look peaceful." That was it. "No. How are you?" "No. Can we talk?" Just a few words typed too carefully, as if afraid to say too much, or maybe afraid I wouldn't reply. I stared at the message for a long time, and then I did something that surprised even me. I replied, "I am." 3 words. Simple. True. He didn't respond right away, and I didn't wait for him to. Instead, I put my phone down and went back to arranging a sympathy bouquet for a woman who'd just lost her sister. The card read, "You don't have to be strong every day, just today." By noon, he texted again. "Would you ever be open to talking? Just not about us, about life, about Benny." That made me pause. Benny. The name still ached, soft and sore in my chest. He wasn't just a dog. He was a thread that held my world together during the unraveling. He had loved me through every version of myself, including the ones I barely recognized. I sat with the message for an hour, then 2. Then I typed, "Coffee, Wednesday, noon. Front bench." No signature, no emotion, just an agreement. When Wednesday came, I didn't dress up. I wore a simple cream sweater, jeans, and the locket I had once considered throwing away, but now wore with a different kind of meaning. Not nostalgia, survival. I brought 2 coffees from the bakery. I didn't know if he still liked his black with a single sugar, but I bought it anyway, for old time's sake. He arrived late. Of course. But when he walked up, I saw something different in his posture. Not guilt, not arrogance, just age. Like life had settled on his shoulders in the months since we last stood face to face. He looked at the bouquet stand beside the bench and smiled faintly. "You kept the wildflowers." I nodded. "They keep finding their way back." He sat down beside me, careful not to brush my arm. There was a space between us. Not wide, but meaningful. It wasn't cold. It was respectful. He looked out at the street for a long time before speaking. "I didn't know how to ask how you were," he said. "And then, after the wedding, it just felt like I didn't have the right." "You didn't," I said gently. "But you do have the right to grief." He blinked at that, surprised. We talked about Benny first. Shared small stories, the way he'd bark at his reflection in the window, the way he always circled 3 times before sleeping. For a moment, we were 2 people mourning the same soul, even if everything else between us had fallen apart. Then he said, "I kept wondering if you'd ever hate me." "I did," I admitted. He nodded, accepting it. "And then," I continued, "I realized hate was just grief in disguise. Once I let go of what I was mourning, there was no space left for you in that way." He looked down, fingers laced together. "I thought I could build a quieter life," he said. "Something easier." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence did the talking for me. Eventually, he stood. "I won't bother you again." "You didn't bother me today," I said. "You showed up." He offered a weak smile. As he turned to leave, he hesitated. "Take care of yourself, Elora." I met his eyes one last time. "I already am." And with that, he walked away. Not out of guilt, not out of defeat, but out of finality. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. There were no tears, no longing looks, no whispered regrets. Just 2 people who once built a life together, sitting beside the ruins of it, not to salvage anything, but to witness what once was, and honor what it became. That night, I told May everything. She hugged me tighter than she had in months and said, "He doesn't deserve this version of you, but I'm glad he saw her." I smiled, not because it hurt less, but because it didn't hurt at all. It was early summer when I realized I no longer measured time by the absence of someone else. I was kneeling in the garden behind the shop, hands deep in potting soil, planting a row of lavender beside the wild daisies, Benny's favorite spot. The sun filtered through the trees in soft golden rays, and the wind carried the smell of new life. Rosemary, lilac, damp earth. I paused and sat back on my heels, staring at the tiny, fresh green shoots pushing their way through the soil. That was me now. No longer uprooted, no longer waiting for someone to rescue me from the loneliness, just growing, steady, quiet, alive. I remembered something my father used to say whenever he'd patch something around the house, a cracked pipe, a wobbly shelf, a broken fence post. "You don't always need to fix it the way it was. Just fix it so it works for who you are now." That had become my truth. I hadn't fixed my life back to the way it was before Colin left. I had rebuilt it around who I had become since. And who I had become was not some hardened, bitter version of myself. I was softer, strangely, but not weaker. Softer like river rock shaped by current and time, the kind of softness that knows its strength. I no longer needed apologies or explanations. I no longer rehearsed what I would say if Colin ever asked for one more chance. I no longer replayed the moment at the altar in my head. That story had ended, and I had stopped flipping back to the last chapter. Now, I lived in the current page. On Sundays, I hosted community bouquet circles in the studio next door, the one I quietly leased months ago. Women of all ages came, some with visible grief, some just looking for color in their lives. We made messy arrangements and talked about things that mattered, things lost, things found, things we'd never speak aloud outside that circle. And in those moments, surrounded by fragrant petals and laughter, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: belonging. Not because I was someone's wife, not because I was proving a point, just because I was showing up fully, as Allura. The shop thrived. I hired a young assistant named Mia who reminded me of myself in my early 30s. Curious, passionate, fearless in the way only people who haven't yet been broken can be. I didn't warn her about heartbreak. I just modeled what healing could look like. Sometimes people from my old life passed through, a few former mutual friends, a distant cousin, even Colin's niece, who came in shyly asking for flowers for her prom. She didn't mention him. I didn't ask. We smiled at each other with mutual understanding, as if to say, life goes on. And thank God it does. One night after closing, I sat on the back porch of the shop with a mug of mint tea in hand. The stars were just beginning to blink awake. The hum of crickets filled the air. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and leaned back in the chair Benny used to nap under. And I thought of him. Not Colin, Benny. My steady, loyal shadow. My quiet witness to all the unraveling and rebuilding. The one who never once stopped waiting at the door. I whispered, "We're okay now." And I meant it. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was no longer afraid of what wasn't. The final reflection wasn't a monologue. It wasn't a lesson wrapped up with a bow. It was a stillness. The kind you only reach after walking through the fire and refusing to become ash. I didn't need to retell the story anymore. I had lived it, and more importantly, I had lived through it. So when customers walked into my shop and asked, "How do you always know just what kind of flowers someone needs?" I smiled and handed them a bouquet I made with my own 2 hands, petals full of quiet survival. And I said, because I've needed them too.